March 15, 1943. The frequency spectrum above occupied Europe crackled with invisible warfare as sophisticated German communication networks coordinated military operations across a 1,000-mile front. In a converted recording studio buried 3 levels beneath the streets of London, Technical Sergeant Marcus Rhythm Washington adjusted his headphones and prepared to unleash the most unconventional weapon the Allied forces had ever deployed against enemy communications. The German military leadership believed their advanced radio encryption systems were impenetrable, their coordination networks secure from Allied interference. They could not have been more wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the following 18 months would prove that sometimes the most sophisticated military technology could be defeated, not by superior engineering, but by the raw creative genius of American jazz and the determination of one man who refused to let his race define his contribution to the war effort. Marcus Washington had never intended to become a secret weapon. Born in 1918 in the Treme district of New Orleans, he grew up surrounded by the revolutionary sounds that would later reshape American music. His grandmother, Celestine Washington, had been present at Congo Square when the earliest jazz pioneers first blended African rhythms with European harmonies. By age 12, Marcus could improvise complex polyrhythmic patterns on drums that left veteran musicians shaking their heads in amazement. The young man's musical gifts extended far beyond rhythm. He possessed what his teachers called perfect pitch plus. Not only could he identify any note played within a 12-tone scale, but he could detect minute frequency variations that most trained musicians missed entirely. This extraordinary auditory sensitivity would prove invaluable in ways no one could have predicted when war engulfed Europe. When the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, Marcus enlisted immediately, despite knowing the military's segregated structure would limit his opportunities. He reported to Fort Benning, Georgia, expecting assignment to a labor battalion or mess hall duty. Instead, a chance encounter during processing would redirect his entire military career. Captain Harold Morrison, a communications officer and amateur jazz enthusiast, overheard Marcus humming complex harmonies while waiting in line for equipment issue. Morrison had spent 2 years developing radio jamming techniques for the Army Signal Corps and recognized something extraordinary in the young recruit's musical intuition. "Soldier, what's your civilian background?" Morrison asked. "Professional drummer, sir. Played with some of the best bands in New Orleans before enlisting," Marcus replied, maintaining military posture despite his surprise at the officer's interest. Morrison studied the recruitment paperwork. Marcus had scored in the 98th percentile on mechanical aptitude tests and showed exceptional mathematical reasoning abilities. More intriguingly, his hearing test results were off the charts. He could distinguish frequency variations as small as 3 Hz, far beyond normal human capability. "How familiar are you with radio technology, Washington?" "Not much formal training, sir, but I've been building crystal radio sets since I was 10. Music and radio waves aren't that different when you understand the mathematics behind frequency relationships." That conversation launched Marcus into the most classified communications unit in the European theater. Within 6 months, he was stationed at a secret facility beneath London's bombed-out districts, working with equipment that most military personnel had never seen. The British had been experimenting with radio jamming since early 1941, but their efforts followed conventional approaches, broadcasting static or competing signals on the same frequencies used by German military communications. These methods achieved limited success because German engineers quickly adapted, changing frequencies and developing more sophisticated encryption protocols. Marcus's arrival coincided with a breakthrough in Allied intelligence gathering. Through captured equipment and decoded transmissions, communications specialists had identified patterns in German radio operations that revealed something unexpected about their encryption systems. The German military used a complex network of synchronized radio transmitters, operating on precisely calibrated frequencies. Their encryption relied not just on coded messages, but on the exact timing relationships between multiple transmission sources. If operators could disrupt these timing relationships without completely blocking the signals, the entire network would become unreliable. Previous jamming attempts had focused on overpowering German signals with stronger broadcasts. Marcus suggested a completely different approach inspired by jazz improvisation techniques. "In jazz, we don't try to drown out other instruments," he explained to a skeptical engineering team. "We play around them, with them, against them. We create rhythmic and harmonic tension that makes the audience hear something entirely different from what any individual musician is playing." Captain Morrison, now promoted to major and heading the specialized jamming unit, encouraged Marcus to develop this concept further. Working with captured German radio equipment, Marcus began studying the mathematical relationships underlying enemy communication protocols. He discovered that German transmissions followed rigid timing patterns, much like classical European music compositions. Each radio operator adhered to precise scheduling, transmitting at exactly calculated intervals to maintain network synchronization. This clockwork precision, designed to ensure reliability, actually created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood complex rhythmic relationships. Marcus developed what he privately called frequency jazz, carefully timed radio transmissions that interfered with German communications not by blocking them, but by introducing subtle timing disruptions that threw their entire network out of synchronization. The technique required extraordinary precision. Marcus had to monitor multiple German frequencies simultaneously, identify their transmission patterns, then broadcast brief signal bursts at exactly the right moments to create cumulative timing errors throughout the enemy network. His first successful test occurred on a quiet Tuesday morning in September 1943. German forces in northern France were coordinating a supply convoy movement using their standard encrypted radio protocols. Marcus had been monitoring their communications for 3 days, mapping the precise timing relationships between 7 different transmission sources. At 0800 hours, as German operators began their morning coordination sequence, Marcus began his interference. Instead of broadcasting jamming signals continuously, he transmitted brief bursts of precisely calculated radio noise at irregular intervals, the radio equivalent of a jazz drummer's syncopated rhythms. The German operators initially noticed nothing unusual. Their individual radios continued receiving signals normally. However, the cumulative effect of Marcus's rhythmic interference gradually threw their network's timing synchronization off by microseconds, then milliseconds, then entire seconds. By 0930 hours, German field commanders were reporting communication difficulties. Messages arrived out of sequence. Coordinates became scrambled. What should have been a routine supply operation dissolved into confusion as radio operators struggled to maintain contact with units that seemed to be responding to completely different orders. The convoy never reached its destination. 3 supply trucks took wrong routes and were captured by French resistance fighters who had been alerted by British intelligence. The entire operation collapsed, not because of military action, but because the enemy's communications had become unreliable at the worst possible moment. Major Morrison was amazed by the results. "How did you know exactly when to transmit those interference bursts?" Marcus smiled, adjusting the frequency dials with the fluid motion of a musician tuning his instrument. "Same way I know when to drop an unexpected snare hit during a trumpet solo. You feel the rhythm, understand the pattern, then you break it at just the right moment to create maximum impact." Word of the successful test reached highest levels of Allied command within days. General Dwight Eisenhower himself reviewed reports of the new jamming technique and immediately ordered expansion of the program. By October 1943, Marcus was training a select group of communications specialists in his unconventional methods. The training proved challenging for traditionally minded military personnel. Most radio operators had been taught to follow precise technical procedures and avoid improvisation. Marcus's approach required them to develop musical intuition and creative timing, skills that couldn't be learned from technical manuals. "Think of German radio networks like a big orchestra playing classical music," Marcus explained to his first class of 12 trainees. "Every instrument follows the same conductor, keeps perfect time, plays exactly what's written on the page. Our job isn't to make more noise than their orchestra. We want to be the jazz band playing in the next room. Different rhythm, different tempo, different style, until their conductor can't keep his musicians together anymore. Some trainees struggled with the concept. Sergeant Robert Chen, an electronics specialist from California, had trouble abandoning systematic approaches in favor of intuitive timing. "I need specific formulas, exact calculations. This feels too random." "It's not random," Marcus replied patiently. "Jazz might sound spontaneous, but it's built on sophisticated mathematical relationships. The difference is that we're creating those relationships in real time instead of following predetermined patterns." To demonstrate, Marcus had Chen monitor a practice German radio network while he performed different types of interference. First, he broadcast standard jamming signals, continuous static designed to overpower the enemy transmissions. "Hear how they adapt?" Marcus asked, as the practice German operators quickly switched to backup frequencies. "They know how to deal with that kind of interference because it's predictable." Next, Marcus began his frequency jazz approach. Brief bursts of noise, timed according to rhythmic patterns. He improvised based on the German transmission schedule. Within minutes, the practice network began experiencing timing errors and coordination failures. "Now they can't adapt because they don't understand what's causing the problem," Marcus explained. "They're looking for technical malfunctions instead of recognizing they're being deliberately disrupted by someone who understands rhythm better than they understand radio engineering." Chen and the other trainees gradually mastered basic frequency jazz techniques, though none approached Marcus's natural ability. His unique combination of perfect pitch, mathematical intuition, and deep understanding of complex rhythmic relationships made him irreplaceable as the primary operator for the most sensitive missions. By December 1943, Allied intelligence had identified Marcus's work as a significant factor in German communication difficulties across occupied Europe. Enemy field reports, intercepted and decoded by British cryptographers, revealed growing frustration with unexplained radio malfunctions that seemed to occur at the worst possible moments. German engineers launched intensive investigations to identify the source of their communication problems. They tested equipment extensively, replaced transmitters, modified encryption protocols, and retrained operators. Nothing worked because they were searching for technical solutions to what was essentially an artistic problem. Marcus's reputation spread throughout the Allied communication networks. Officers who had never heard jazz music found themselves requesting briefings on rhythm theory and improvisation techniques. The most classified radio jamming unit in the European theatre began recruiting musicians alongside traditional electronics specialists. Corporal James "Sweet Swing" Thompson, a former big band saxophone player from Chicago, proved particularly adept at Marcus's techniques. His musical background in swing rhythms translated naturally to radio interference patterns, and soon he was conducting successful jamming operations against German communications in northern Italy. Private First Class Sarah Chen, Sergeant Chen's sister, and an accomplished pianist, became the first female operator trained in frequency jazz methods. Her classical music background initially hindered her progress, but once she learned to abandon rigid timing structures in favor of improvised rhythmic relationships, her technical precision made her extremely effective. The diversity of the expanded jamming unit reflected both military necessity and Marcus's personal influence. Despite the military's segregated structure, his specialized skills had earned him unprecedented authority to recommend personnel selections. He consistently advocated for the most talented individuals, regardless of race or background, arguing that musical ability transcended social categories. "Music is about communication that goes deeper than language," Marcus told Major Morrison during one personnel discussion. "When we're jamming German radios, we're not fighting as black soldiers, or white soldiers, or male soldiers, or female soldiers. We're fighting as musicians who understand something the enemy doesn't understand about rhythm and timing and creative expression." This philosophical approach proved strategically valuable as well as morally significant. The expanded jamming unit's diverse perspectives contributed to developing new interference techniques that no single individual could have created alone. Sarah Chen's classical training led to breakthrough methods for disrupting German communications that relied on precise harmonic relationships. Her technique involved broadcasting signals that were harmonically related to German frequencies but slightly out of tune, the radio equivalent of a piano with certain keys tuned incorrectly. Sweet Swing Thompson developed rhythm patterns inspired by complex jazz compositions that could maintain interference effectiveness even when German operators attempted to change frequencies rapidly. His approach treated the entire radio spectrum like a vast musical instrument that could be played to create whatever effects the tactical situation required. Marcus continued developing his original frequency jazz concepts throughout 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the massive cross-channel invasion that would establish a second front in Western Europe. The planned operation, codenamed Overlord, would require unprecedented coordination between air, sea, and land forces, coordination that depended entirely on reliable communications. German military leadership recognized that Allied invasion preparations were reaching critical stages. They significantly enhanced their radio security protocols and communication monitoring capabilities throughout the winter and spring of 1944. Counterintelligence efforts specifically focused on identifying and eliminating whatever was causing their persistent communication difficulties. In March 1944, German signal intelligence units began sophisticated direction-finding operations designed to locate the source of radio interference plaguing their networks. Using triangulation techniques and sensitive detection equipment, they traced several jamming transmissions to the London area. Major Morrison briefed Marcus on the developing threat during a secure planning session. German reconnaissance flights have increased over southeastern England. We're seeing evidence of electronic intelligence gathering that suggests they're trying to locate our jamming operations. Are they getting close? Marcus asked, reviewing reconnaissance photographs showing German aircraft equipped with specialized radio detection equipment. Close enough that we're moving the primary operations to a new facility. Construction is nearly complete on an underground complex outside Birmingham that should provide better security and expanded operational capabilities. The relocation to Birmingham occurred in early April 1944. The new facility, designated Station X-Ray, represented the most advanced radio warfare installation Allied forces had constructed. 3 levels underground, with independently powered transmission equipment and direct communication links to Supreme Allied Command. Marcus found the new workspace impressive, but sterile compared to the improvised London studio where he had developed his techniques. The Birmingham facility featured precisely calibrated frequency generators, automated transmission timing systems, and computer-assisted signal analysis equipment. Everything designed for maximum technical efficiency and minimal human error. Feels like playing jazz with a metronome, Marcus observed to Sarah Chen as they familiarized themselves with the new equipment. All the timing is perfect, but there's no room for the creative mistakes that make music interesting. Chen understood his concern. Can we modify some of this equipment to allow for more improvisation? Marcus spent several days working with the technical staff to adjust the automated systems. He needed equipment that could respond to his musical intuition while maintaining the precision required for effective radio interference. The solution involved bypassing certain automated controls and creating manual override systems that allowed real-time adjustment of transmission parameters. By late April, Station X-Ray was operational and conducting regular jamming missions against German communications throughout occupied Europe. The expanded facilities allowed Marcus's team to monitor and interfere with enemy radio traffic across a much broader geographic area than had been possible from London. The timing proved crucial. Allied invasion preparations were reaching their final stages, and German forces were implementing enhanced communication protocols designed to coordinate rapid response to any cross-channel attack. The enemy's improved radio security presented new challenges that required all of Marcus's creative abilities to overcome. German radio operators had learned to recognize certain patterns in Allied jamming attempts and developed counter-techniques to maintain communication effectiveness despite interference. They began using rapid frequency changes, redundant transmission paths, and encrypted timing signals that were much more difficult to disrupt than earlier systems. Marcus realized he needed to evolve his frequency jazz approach to keep pace with German innovations. Working with his expanded team, he developed what they called symphonic jamming, coordinated interference involving multiple operators working together like sections of an orchestra. The new technique required unprecedented teamwork and timing precision. Sarah Chen would monitor German harmonic relationships and provide underlying bassline interference that established rhythmic foundations. Sweet Swing Thompson handled melody line jamming that created more obvious disruptions to draw German attention. Marcus coordinated the entire effort, improvising complex rhythmic relationships that tied together his teammates' individual contributions. Their first major test of symphonic jamming occurred during the final week of May 1944. German forces in Normandy were conducting extensive communication exercises as part of their preparation for the expected Allied invasion. The exercises provided perfect opportunities to test new interference techniques without revealing Allied invasion plans. At 0600 hours on May 28th, German radio networks across northern France began their daily coordination sequence. 3 Army Corps, 2 Luftwaffe wings, and multiple naval units commenced synchronized communication exercises designed to test their readiness for major combat operations. Marcus and his team had been monitoring German preparations for weeks, mapping communication patterns and identifying vulnerabilities in the enhanced security protocols. As German operators began their morning exercises, Station X-Ray initiated the most complex jamming operation attempted to date. Sarah Chen established harmonic interference patterns that created subtle frequency instabilities throughout the German network. Her signals were barely detectable individually, but combined to create cumulative timing errors that gradually degraded overall communication effectiveness. Sweet Swing Thompson began melodic interference sequences that drew German attention to obvious jamming attempts while concealing the more sophisticated harmonic disruptions Sarah was creating. His obvious jamming provided cover for the real attack. Marcus coordinated both efforts while adding his own rhythmic interference patterns. His timing was based on complex polyrhythmic structures, inspired by traditional African drumming techniques his grandmother had taught him decades earlier. The mathematical relationships underlying these rhythms created interference patterns that German radio operators had never encountered. By 0800 hours, German communication exercises were experiencing significant difficulties. Field commanders reported receiving contradictory orders. Naval units lost contact with coastal defense installations. Luftwaffe squadrons struggled to maintain coordination with ground-based operations centers. The German military leadership initially attributed these problems to equipment malfunctions or operator errors. They had no framework for understanding that their communication difficulties were caused by 3 musicians sitting in an underground facility in central England, improvising complex rhythmic relationships in real time. German signal intelligence units detected Allied jamming activity but could not identify the source or develop effective countermeasures. The symphonic jamming technique produced interference patterns that seemed random, but were actually based on sophisticated mathematical relationships that created maximum cumulative disruption. By noon, German exercises had become so disrupted that commanding officers called for complete communication system resets. Units spent the afternoon conducting equipment checks and retraining operators on backup protocols. The entire day's training exercise was effectively lost. Allied intelligence monitoring of German communications revealed the exercise's collapse and provided valuable insights into enemy response patterns. More importantly, the successful symphonic jamming demonstration proved that Marcus's team could disrupt German communications on the scale required for major military operations. Major Morrison briefed Supreme Allied Command on the May 28th test results. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army designated for the upcoming invasion, was particularly interested in the jamming unit's capabilities. "Can your people maintain this level of interference during extended combat operations?" Bradley asked. "Yes, sir," Morrison replied. "Technical Sergeant Washington and his team have developed sustainable techniques that can operate continuously for days or weeks without losing effectiveness. What about German countermeasures? They're not going to ignore communication problems during an invasion. Marcus, present for the briefing at Morrison's request, addressed the general's concern. German engineers keep looking for technical solutions to what they think are technical problems. They don't understand that they're dealing with creative, improvised interference that adapts faster than they can develop countermeasures. General Bradley studied the young technical sergeant with evident curiosity. The highest levels of Allied command included few black personnel, and Marcus's presence at such a classified briefing was highly unusual. "Explain how your technique works, Sergeant." Marcus had prepared for this question. "German communications follow rigid timing patterns like classical music. Our interference uses jazz improvisation principles to disrupt those patterns. Jazz musicians learn to create complex rhythmic relationships spontaneously, which means our jamming adapts in real time to whatever the Germans try. And you believe this approach will remain effective during invasion operations?" "Yes, sir. Actually, it should be more effective during combat, because German operators will be under stress and less able to adapt to unexpected interference patterns." General Bradley approved expanded jamming operations in support of the cross-channel invasion. Station X-Ray received priority resource allocation and authorization to recruit additional personnel with musical backgrounds from throughout the Allied forces. The final weeks before the invasion saw intensive preparation and training as Marcus's team prepared to support the largest military operation in human history. They conducted daily practice sessions, refined symphonic jamming techniques, and developed contingency plans for various tactical scenarios. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility as June 6th approached. Thousands of Allied soldiers would depend on successful communications during the invasion. German defensive responses would be coordinated through the same radio networks his team was preparing to disrupt. The margin for error was essentially zero. On June 4th, weather conditions forced postponement of invasion operations. Marcus and his team remained at full readiness in Station X-Ray, monitoring German communications and conducting final equipment checks. The delay created additional stress, but also provided extra time to prepare for the most important mission of their careers. June 5th brought improved weather forecasts and confirmation that invasion operations would commence the following morning. At 1800 hours, Marcus received final operational orders from Major Morrison. German communications must be disrupted beginning at 0100 hours June 6th and continuing until further notice. Primary objectives are enemy coastal defense coordination and reinforcement requests from forward units to reserve formations. "Understood, sir. We're ready." Marcus briefed his team on their specific assignments for the invasion support mission. Sarah Chen would focus on disrupting German naval communications along the Normandy coast. Sweet Swing Thompson would target Luftwaffe coordination networks. Marcus would handle Army communications, particularly those linking forward defensive positions with reserve units stationed inland. At midnight on June 6, 1944, the largest seaborne invasion in history began as Allied forces commenced crossing the English Channel toward the beaches of Normandy. Simultaneously, 3 levels beneath the English countryside, Technical Sergeant Marcus Washington and his team initiated the most critical radio jamming operation of the Second World War. German coastal defense networks activated as radar stations detected the approaching Allied fleet. Radio transmissions increased dramatically as enemy commanders attempted to coordinate defensive responses to the massive invasion force. This was the moment Marcus had been preparing for since that first conversation with Captain Morrison nearly 3 years earlier. German radio operators began transmitting urgent messages requesting immediate reinforcement from reserve units. Coastal defense batteries needed fire control coordination. Luftwaffe squadrons required flight instructions and target assignments. The entire defensive response depended on rapid, reliable communication between military units scattered across hundreds of miles. Marcus initiated frequency jazz interference patterns, targeting the most critical German communication links. His timing was based on months of studying enemy radio protocols, combined with his intuitive understanding of rhythmic relationships that German engineers could not comprehend. Sarah Chen began harmonic interference against German naval communications. Her technique created frequency instabilities that made radio transmissions increasingly unreliable as German naval units attempted to coordinate defensive actions against Allied landing craft approaching the beaches. Sweet Swing Thompson focused his melodic jamming on Luftwaffe networks. His interference patterns drew German attention to obvious jamming attempts while concealing more sophisticated disruptions that gradually degraded Air Force communication effectiveness. The symphonic jamming technique proved devastatingly effective during the invasion's opening hours. German defensive responses became increasingly disorganized as communication failures accumulated throughout their command structure. By 0400 hours, German field commanders were reporting widespread communication difficulties to higher headquarters. Messages requesting reinforcements never reached their intended recipients. Coastal defense batteries lost contact with fire control centers. Luftwaffe squadrons received contradictory flight instructions or no instructions at all. Allied forces landing on the Normandy beaches encountered fierce resistance from prepared German defensive positions. However, the enemy's response lacked the coordination that effective communications would have provided. Reserve units that should have counterattacked within hours of the initial landings never received deployment orders. German signal intelligence units detected massive Allied jamming activity but could not identify specific sources or develop immediate countermeasures. The frequency jazz techniques produced interference patterns that seemed to emerge from multiple locations simultaneously, making traditional direction-finding methods ineffective. Marcus and his team maintained continuous operations throughout June 6th and into the following day. They worked in rotating shifts, with at least 2 operators maintaining jamming activities at all times. The sustained effort required extraordinary physical and mental stamina, particularly given the stress of supporting such a critical operation. By June 7th, Allied forces had established secure beachheads across a 50-mile front in Normandy. German defensive responses had been significantly degraded by communication failures that prevented effective coordination between forward units and strategic reserves. The invasion's success depended on many factors, but reliable communications for Allied forces and disrupted communications for German forces played crucial roles. General Bradley's after-action reports specifically mentioned the effectiveness of radio jamming operations during the invasion's opening phases. Enemy defensive responses showed clear evidence of communication difficulties that contributed significantly to our ability to establish and expand beachhead positions. Marcus felt profound satisfaction reading those reports, but also recognized that the invasion's success was only the beginning. German forces would adapt to Allied jamming techniques, requiring continuous innovation to maintain communication advantages as fighting moved inland from the Normandy beaches. Throughout the summer and fall of 1944, Marcus's team continued developing new interference techniques as Allied forces advanced across France toward Germany. German communication security improved significantly as their engineers developed partial countermeasures to frequency jazz jamming methods. The cat-and-mouse game between Allied jammers and German radio operators became increasingly sophisticated. German forces began using rapid frequency changes, redundant communication paths, and encrypted timing signals designed to resist rhythmic interference. Marcus responded by developing even more complex improvisation techniques that anticipated and countered German adaptations. By September 1944, Marcus had trained over 40 specialists in various frequency jazz techniques. Station X-ray expanded to include multiple operational centers across England, allowing simultaneous jamming operations against German communications throughout occupied Europe. The program had evolved from Marcus's individual creativity into a comprehensive electronic warfare capability. The musical backgrounds of jamming operators proved consistently valuable throughout the campaign. Personnel with jazz experience showed particular aptitude for the complex improvisation required, while classical musicians excelled at harmonic interference techniques. Even folk musicians contributed unique perspectives on rhythm and timing relationships that enhanced overall operational effectiveness. Marcus received promotion to Staff Sergeant in October 1944, along with a commendation from Supreme Allied Command, recognizing his extraordinary contributions to electronic warfare capabilities. The promotion came with increased responsibilities for training and strategic planning as Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany. The approach of winter brought new challenges as German forces consolidated defensive positions along the Rhine River. Their communication networks incorporated lessons learned from months of dealing with Allied jamming, making them more resistant to established interference techniques. Marcus spent November and December developing what he called seasonal jazz, interference patterns based on the longer rhythmic cycles found in extended musical compositions. These techniques required coordination between multiple jamming stations over periods of hours or days, creating cumulative effects that gradually degraded German communication reliability without triggering immediate countermeasures. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the ultimate test of Marcus's enhanced jamming capabilities. German forces launched their largest offensive since 1941, requiring extensive coordination between multiple Army Corps and reserve units. The attack's success depended entirely on maintaining reliable communications under combat conditions. Allied intelligence had detected German offensive preparations, but underestimated their scope and timing. When the attack began on December 16th, Allied forces were caught off guard by the strength and coordination of the German assault. Communication failures on the Allied side contributed to initial confusion and tactical setbacks. Marcus's team responded by implementing the most intensive jamming operations of the entire conflict. Working around the clock shifts, they focused all available resources on disrupting German coordination during the offensive's critical opening phases. German radio networks during the offensive carried unprecedented message volumes as commanders attempted to coordinate complex multi-unit operations across a 100-mile front. The increased communication activity provided more targets for Allied jamming, but also made it more difficult to achieve significant disruption effects. Marcus adapted his techniques to the changed conditions by developing combat jazz, rapid-fire interference patterns designed to create maximum short-term disruption during critical tactical moments. Instead of gradual timing degradation, combat jazz aimed to cause immediate communication failures during specific operations. The approach required precise intelligence about German tactical timing. Allied code breakers provided real-time information about enemy operational schedules, allowing Marcus to coordinate jamming attacks with German communication peaks. When enemy units attempted to coordinate artillery strikes or request reinforcements, their radio transmissions encountered carefully timed interference that disrupted critical coordination. By December 22nd, German offensive momentum was slowing as communication difficulties accumulated throughout their command structure. Units lost contact with supporting elements. Artillery coordination became increasingly unreliable. Requests for supplies and reinforcements often never reached appropriate headquarters. German engineers recognized that their communication problems exceeded normal combat degradation. Signal intelligence reports identified systematic interference of unknown origin, affecting multiple communication networks simultaneously. However, their attempts to develop countermeasures were hampered by the improvised nature of frequency jazz techniques. The tide turned decisively in favor of Allied forces as German offensive capabilities collapsed under the weight of coordination failures. Communication disruptions prevented effective tactical responses to Allied counterattacks. By January 1945, German forces were retreating across the Rhine toward their homeland. Marcus's contribution to stopping the German offensive earned him a Bronze Star and promotion to Technical Sergeant First Class. The citation read, "For exceptional performance of duty in connection with electronic warfare operations that contributed significantly to the defeat of enemy offensive actions." More meaningful to Marcus was a personal letter from General Eisenhower acknowledging his innovative contributions to Allied communications capabilities. Your creative approaches to electronic warfare have provided strategic advantages that conventional military techniques could not have achieved. The success of our operations owes much to your unique talents and dedicated service. As Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine and advance into Germany during spring 1945, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from New Orleans jazz clubs to the cutting edge of military technology. His musical background, initially seen as irrelevant to military service, had become the foundation for revolutionary electronic warfare capabilities. The integration of musical concepts with radio technology had produced results that neither traditional military thinking nor conventional engineering approaches could have achieved. Jazz improvisation principles had proven applicable to sophisticated technical challenges, demonstrating connections between artistic creativity and scientific innovation that would influence military thinking for decades. Marcus's team continued operations through the final months of the conflict in Europe, adapting their techniques to the changing tactical situation as German resistance collapsed. Their jamming capabilities evolved into comprehensive electronic warfare systems that would influence military communications technology long after the immediate conflict ended. The fall of Germany in May 1945 brought formal conclusion to Marcus's wartime service, but not to his contributions to military communications. Post-war analysis revealed that frequency jazz techniques had contributed to German communication failures during numerous critical operations throughout the final 18 months of the European conflict. Allied intelligence estimates suggested that communication disruptions caused by Marcus's jamming operations had reduced German operational effectiveness by 15 to 20% during major engagements. This seemingly modest percentage translated into thousands of lives, saved and shortened the conflict's duration by an estimated 2 to 3 months. Marcus returned to civilian life in 1946 with technical knowledge and leadership experience that opened opportunities previously unavailable to black musicians from working-class backgrounds. He used his military electronics training to establish a recording studio in Chicago that became a center for innovative jazz recording techniques during the bebop revolution of the late 1940s. His studio, Washington Sound, introduced technical innovations inspired by his wartime experience with frequency manipulation and timing relationships. Recording techniques he developed influenced the evolution of modern jazz and contributed to the emergence of rhythm and blues and early rock and roll music. Marcus never spoke publicly about his classified military service during the war. The frequency jazz techniques remained classified for decades, and his wartime innovations were known only to a small circle of military communications specialists. However, his influence on post-war music technology indirectly spread knowledge of advanced audio engineering concepts throughout the recording industry. The musicians who trained under Marcus during the war pursued diverse careers that carried frequency jazz principles into civilian applications. Sarah Chen became a prominent electrical engineer and contributed to early television broadcasting technology development. Sweet Swing Thompson returned to professional music, but also worked part-time with radio manufacturers, applying his wartime experience to civilian communication equipment design. Major Morrison, promoted to colonel by war's end, remained in military service and oversaw development of electronic warfare capabilities during the early Cold War period. He consistently credited Marcus's innovations as foundational to subsequent advances in military communications technology. The broader implications of Marcus's wartime service extended beyond immediate military applications. His success demonstrated that creative approaches to technical problems could produce revolutionary solutions that conventional thinking could not achieve. The integration of artistic and scientific perspectives became a model for innovation in various fields during the post-war technological boom. Marcus's story also highlighted the contributions of minority service members whose talents were often overlooked or underutilized due to social prejudices. His technical innovations occurred despite, not because of, the military's racial policies. His success suggested how much potential was wasted when institutional barriers prevented full utilization of available human resources. The frequency jazz techniques Marcus developed influenced electronic warfare capabilities throughout the Cold War era and beyond. Modern military communications systems incorporate principles derived from his wartime innovations, though few current practitioners recognize the musical origins of these technical concepts. Marcus Washington lived to see the transformation of American society that followed the war, including the civil rights movement that gradually dismantled legal segregation. He never sought recognition for his military service, but took quiet satisfaction in knowing that his contributions had helped preserve the democracy that eventually extended its full benefits to all citizens, regardless of race. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, portions of Marcus's military records were declassified as part of routine historical document releases. Military historians studying electronic warfare development during World War II began recognizing his innovative contributions to Allied victory. A technical journal article published in 1987 described frequency jazz techniques as among the most creative and effective electronic warfare innovations of the Second World War. The article noted that musical approaches to signal interference had no precedent in military history and represented entirely new thinking about communication disruption methods. Marcus was invited to speak at several military communications conferences during the late 1980s. His presentations attracted audiences of engineers and officers eager to understand how musical concepts had produced such effective military technologies. These speaking engagements represented his first public acknowledgement of his classified wartime service. During one memorable presentation at the Army Signal School, Marcus demonstrated frequency jazz techniques using modern radio equipment. The audience of experienced communications specialists watched in amazement as he created complex interference patterns that disrupted practice military networks through rhythmic manipulation alone, without using any conventional jamming methods. The mathematics of music and the mathematics of radio waves are essentially identical, Marcus explained to the fascinated audience. Once you understand that rhythm is just another way of organizing frequency relationships over time, it becomes obvious that musical improvisation techniques can be applied to electronic warfare. Marcus's demonstrations inspired a new generation of military communications specialists to explore creative approaches to technical challenges. Several officers pursued advanced studies in both music theory and electronic engineering, seeking to build on the foundation Marcus had established decades earlier. The end of the Cold War brought further declassification of Marcus's wartime records and fuller recognition of his contributions to Allied victory. Military historians ranked frequency jazz among the most significant technological innovations of World War II, noting its influence on subsequent electronic warfare development. Marcus Washington passed away in 1995 at age 77, surrounded by family and friends in his Chicago home. His obituary in the music trade papers focused on his contributions to post-war recording technology and jazz innovation, mentioning only briefly his distinguished military service during World War II. The full scope of his wartime achievements remained classified until 1998, when the Department of Defense released comprehensive documentation about World War II electronic warfare operations. Marcus's innovations were finally revealed to the public more than 50 years after he first used jazz improvisation to disrupt German military communications. Modern military communication systems incorporate numerous technological concepts that trace their origins to Marcus's wartime work. Frequency hopping, adaptive timing protocols, and improvised interference patterns all reflect principles he pioneered during the 1940s. Contemporary electronic warfare specialists study his techniques as foundational examples of creative problem-solving applied to complex technical challenges. The Marcus Washington Center for Innovation in Military Communications, established at the Army Signal School in 2001, continues research into creative approaches to communication technology. The center's mission reflects Marcus's belief that breakthrough innovations often emerge from unexpected combinations of artistic and scientific perspectives. His legacy extends beyond immediate military applications to broader questions about creativity, innovation, and the value of diverse perspectives in solving complex problems. Marcus's story demonstrates how individual talents, Even those that seem irrelevant to particular challenges can produce revolutionary solutions when given appropriate opportunities for expression. The integration of musical concepts with radio technology that Marcus pioneered has influenced fields far beyond military communications. Modern telecommunications, computer networking, and digital signal processing all utilize principles derived from his frequency jazz techniques. The rhythmic manipulation of electronic signals has become fundamental to numerous contemporary technologies. Marcus Washington's journey from New Orleans jazz clubs to secret military installations beneath London represents one of the most remarkable stories of innovation and service during World War II. His unique combination of musical genius, mathematical insight, and creative courage produced technological breakthroughs that shortened the conflict and saved countless lives. His story also reflects broader themes about talent, opportunity, and social justice. During a period of dramatic historical change, Marcus overcame significant racial barriers to make extraordinary contributions to Allied victory, demonstrating both individual excellence and the broader potential that can be unlocked when society provides equal opportunities for all its members. The frequency jazz techniques that seemed so unconventional in 1943 became foundational to modern electronic warfare capabilities. Marcus's integration of jazz improvisation with radio technology created entirely new possibilities for communication disruption that conventional military thinking had never considered. Today, as military forces face increasingly sophisticated communication challenges in an interconnected world, Marcus Washington's example continues to inspire creative approaches to complex technical problems. His legacy reminds us that breakthrough innovations often emerge from unexpected sources, and that the most effective solutions frequently combine insights from seemingly unrelated fields. The young man who adjusted his headphones in a London basement on that March morning in 1943 could not have imagined how his musical intuition would reshape military communications technology for generations to come. His story stands as testimony to the power of creative thinking, the value of diverse perspectives, and the extraordinary contributions that individuals can make when their unique talents align with historical necessity. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.